There are moments in life when the world seems to become quieter, not because everything around us has stopped, but because something within us has changed. Perhaps it happened after a conversation you never expected to have. A phone call that arrived at an ordinary hour, carrying extraordinary news. A goodbye that lasted longer than you imagined. Or maybe it wasn't one dramatic moment at all. Perhaps it was a collection of small disappointments that slowly gathered like clouds until, one day, you looked around and realized the familiar warmth of hope had become difficult to find. Difficult seasons rarely announce themselves. They don't knock politely before entering our lives. Instead, they quietly rearrange our plans. They interrupt dreams we thought were certain. They ask questions we never wanted to answer. And sometimes they leave us standing at the edge of a future that feels unfamiliar. If you've ever walked through such a season, you already know that the hardest part is often not the challenge itself. It is the uncertainty, not knowing how long the pain will last, not knowing whether the life you once knew will ever return, not knowing if the strength you need will still be there tomorrow morning. During times like these, the mind has a curious habit. It begins to whisper that this feeling is permanent, that this chapter is the whole story, that somehow the light you once carried has disappeared forever. Yet if there is one lesson quietly repeated throughout nature, throughout history, and throughout countless human lives, it is this. The darkest night has never prevented the arrival of dawn. Winter has never persuaded spring to stay away. Storms, however fierce they seem, have never remained forever. Perhaps hope is not the absence of difficulty. Perhaps hope is the quiet courage to believe that today's reality does not have to become tomorrow's destination. And maybe, just maybe, the season you are walking through right now is not the chapter where your story ends. It is the chapter where something stronger, wiser, and more compassionate begins to grow. If that possibility feels distant today, that's perfectly all right. You don't have to force yourself to believe it all at once. For now, simply allow yourself to walk with me. Sometimes the first step toward hope is not finding answers. It is discovering that we do not have to search for them alone. Welcome to the Hopeful Narrator. This is a place where timeless stories, gentle reflections, and quiet wisdom come together to remind us that even life's most difficult seasons can become the beginning of something meaningful. Whether you're listening while driving beneath an open sky, winding down after a long day, taking a peaceful walk, or preparing for a restful night's sleep, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these moments here. My hope is that each story you hear will offer more than inspiration, that it will offer companionship, that each reflection will gently quiet the noise of the day, that each lesson will remind you that resilience often grows silently, long before we recognize its strength. So wherever this narration finds you today, settle in comfortably. Leave tomorrow's worries where they are for a little while. Together, we'll journey through stories of ordinary people who faced extraordinary seasons, discovering that hope is rarely something we stumble upon. More often, it is something we patiently build, one thought, one choice, one day at a time. And perhaps, before our journey is over, you'll discover that the hope you've been searching for has been quietly walking beside you all along. There once lived a man named Daniel, whose life looked remarkably ordinary from the outside. At 42, he had settled into a rhythm that felt comfortably predictable. Every weekday began with the same alarm at 6 o'clock. He would brew fresh coffee, wave goodbye to his wife Emma as she left a little earlier for work, and drive the familiar 20 minutes to the engineering company where he had worked for nearly 18 years. He knew every shortcut through the city. He knew which receptionist preferred tea over coffee. He knew which colleagues arrived exactly 5 minutes late every Monday morning. There was comfort in that familiarity. Life wasn't perfect, but it felt dependable. Daniel believed, as many of us quietly do, that tomorrow would probably resemble today. Until one Wednesday afternoon it didn't. The meeting invitation had seemed routine. His manager's voice was calm. The explanation was professional. Economic pressures, company restructuring, department closures. None of the words sounded especially personal. Yet together, they changed everything. When Daniel carried the small cardboard box containing family photographs, a coffee mug, and 18 years of memories to his car, the parking lot looked exactly as it always had. People were chatting. Cars came and went. Someone laughed in the distance. The world continued without hesitation. Only Daniel felt as though time had paused. The drive home felt strangely unfamiliar. He had traveled the same road thousands of times, yet every traffic light seemed longer. Every intersection felt uncertain. When he reached home, he sat inside the parked car without turning off the engine. He wasn't thinking about the job itself. He was thinking about everything the job represented: security, routine, identity. The future he had quietly assumed would unfold exactly as planned. Inside the house, Emma noticed he was home early. One look at his face told her everything. She didn't ask questions immediately. She simply wrapped her arms around him. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Sometimes, silence carries more understanding than words ever could. That evening, after dinner sat mostly untouched between them, Daniel found himself staring out the kitchen window. The sun was beginning to disappear behind the neighboring rooftops. "I don't know who I am without this job," he admitted quietly. Emma looked toward the fading light before answering, "Maybe that's not the question." He turned toward her. "Then what is?" She smiled gently. "Maybe the question is, who are you becoming now?" Daniel had no answer. At least, not yet. But without realizing it, the most important journey of his life had already begun. Not the journey toward another career. Not the search for another paycheck. But the quieter journey that every difficult season eventually invites us to take. The journey of discovering that our greatest strength often begins to grow only after the life we expected quietly falls away. And like the first faint light before sunrise, that discovery rarely arrives all at once. It begins with something much smaller, the willingness to stop fighting the reality of where we are, so that we can finally begin walking toward where we are meant to be. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his thoughts circled back to the same questions. What will people think? How long before our savings begin to disappear? What if no one wants to hire someone my age? By morning, he felt as though he had lived through an entire week. Still, habit is a powerful thing. At 6 o'clock, his alarm sounded. Without thinking, he got out of bed, showered, ironed a shirt, and prepared a cup of coffee exactly as he had every weekday for nearly 2 decades. Only when he reached for his car keys did reality gently remind him that there was nowhere he needed to be. He stood in the hallway for several moments, keys in his hand, listening to the quietness of the house. The silence felt unfamiliar. Emma noticed him standing there. "You don't have to pretend today," she said softly. He gave a faint smile. "I suppose I don't." After she left for work, Daniel wandered from room to room, unsure what to do with himself. For years he had complained that there were never enough hours in the day. Now, suddenly, the day stretched endlessly before him. He tried searching online for jobs. He updated his resume. He answered a few emails. Yet none of it quieted the heaviness settling inside him. By early afternoon, he closed the laptop and drove without a destination in mind. Almost without realizing it, he found himself pulling into a small park beside a peaceful lake. A place he and Emma had often visited years earlier when life felt less complicated. The water was perfectly still. A gentle breeze carried the scent of eucalyptus through the air. Several ducks glided quietly across the lake, leaving soft ripples behind them. Daniel sat on a weathered wooden bench and watched the water. For the first time all day, he stopped trying to solve his future. An elderly man was feeding birds nearby. After a while, he wandered over carrying a small paper bag. "Would you like some?" he asked, holding out a few bird seeds. Daniel chuckled. I don't think they'd come anywhere near me. They're usually wiser than we give them credit for. Daniel accepted a handful anyway. Within moments, a few small birds cautiously hopped closer. The old man smiled. They always wait. Wait for what? To see whether you're safe. Daniel scattered the seeds onto the grass. I wish life gave us that much certainty. The old man laughed gently. It never has. They sat together in comfortable silence. After several minutes, the man asked, "Rough day?" Daniel looked out over the lake. "Rough week." Without intending to, he began explaining everything: the redundancy, the uncertainty, the fear of disappointing his family, the feeling that everything he had worked for had disappeared in a single afternoon. When he finished, he looked slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't usually tell strangers my life story." The old man smiled kindly. "Sometimes strangers are easier." Daniel laughed. "I suppose that's true." The man folded the empty paper bag carefully before speaking again. "When I was your age, I lost my farm." Daniel looked at him with surprise. "Really?" "It had belonged to my family for 3 generations. What happened?" "A drought that lasted longer than anyone expected." He paused. "I spent months asking the wrong question. What was that? Why did this happen to me? And what should you have asked?" The old man looked toward the calm water. "What kind of person do I want to become because this happened?" Daniel let the words settle. They felt strangely different from the advice he had been receiving. Friends had already begun suggesting new careers. Relatives offered financial advice. Former colleagues sent job advertisements. All of it came from kindness. Yet no one had asked him who he was becoming. The old man continued, "You know, losing the farm wasn't the hardest part." "What was?" "I believed I'd lost myself." He smiled thoughtfully. "But eventually I discovered something. Our work is something we do. It is not everything we are." Daniel looked down at his hands. For 18 years he had introduced himself in almost exactly the same way. "I'm Daniel. I'm an engineer." Without the second sentence, he suddenly felt incomplete. The old man seemed to notice. "If someone took away your job," he paused, "could they also take away your honesty?" Daniel shook his head. "No." "Your kindness?" "No." "Your patience?" "I hope not." "The way your family loves you?" Daniel smiled faintly. "No." The old man nodded. "Then perhaps the most valuable parts of you are still sitting right where they've always been." Those words stayed with Daniel long after the conversation ended. As the afternoon sun began slipping lower in the sky, he thanked the man and slowly walked back toward his car. The problems waiting for him at home had not disappeared. He still needed another job. Bills still needed to be paid. Nothing practical had changed, yet something inside him felt slightly lighter. Not because he had found answers, because he had found perspective. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. When life suddenly changes, we often mistake the loss of one part of our identity for the loss of our entire identity. A career ends. A relationship changes. Children grow up and leave home. Retirement arrives. An illness limits what we once did with ease. Without realizing it, we begin believing that because one chapter has closed, the whole book has somehow become less valuable. But people have always been far more than the roles they perform. A teacher remains compassionate long after leaving the classroom. A parent continues loving their children long after they become adults. An artist still notices beauty, even on days when no paint touches the canvas. Our deepest qualities travel with us. They are not tied to titles, salaries, or achievements. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. Maybe a change in your own life quietly challenged the way you saw yourself. Perhaps you once measured your worth through productivity, through success, through recognition, through being needed. Then one unexpected season removed those things, leaving you wondering what remained. It is a painful question, but it also carries the possibility of a beautiful discovery. Sometimes life gently removes the labels we have depended upon so we can rediscover the person beneath them. History quietly reflects this truth. Many remarkable lives were redirected by circumstances that initially felt like devastating losses. Some inventions were born after careers unexpectedly ended. Some lifelong callings began only after carefully planned dreams collapsed. Not because disappointment itself was good, but because difficult seasons sometimes clear space for possibilities we would never have explored otherwise. That doesn't make the loss easy. It simply reminds us that loss is not always the end of becoming. As Daniel drove home, he noticed something he hadn't paid attention to in years. The evening sky was painted with soft shades of orange, violet, and gold. He couldn't remember the last time he'd arrived home early enough to watch the sunset. For 18 years, he had been busy building a career. Perhaps now, without choosing it, life was inviting him to build something else as well. Not instead of a career, but alongside it. A deeper understanding of who he truly was. That realization did not erase his uncertainty. It simply gave him enough peace to face tomorrow. And sometimes, that is exactly what hope does. It doesn't illuminate the entire road ahead. It simply gives us enough light to take the next faithful step. Daniel woke the following morning before his alarm. For a few brief seconds, everything felt normal. Then memory quietly returned. The meeting, the cardboard box, the drive home, the uncertainty. He lay still, staring at the ceiling. It would have been easy to remain there, letting fear slowly convince him that another day of waiting lay ahead. Instead, he remembered something the elderly man beside the lake had said. "What kind of person do I want to become because this happened?" It wasn't a question that could be answered once. It had to be answered every day. Daniel rose, made his coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a notebook instead of his laptop. At the top of the page, he wrote 3 simple questions. What can I do today? Who can I encourage today? What can I learn today? The questions seemed almost too ordinary. Yet as he looked at them, he realized they asked him to focus on things that remained within his control. He could not control when the next interview would come. He could not control the economy. He could not control another company's hiring decisions. But he could decide how he spent this day. That single realization made the morning feel less overwhelming. After breakfast, he updated his resume once more and sent applications to 3 companies. Instead of spending the afternoon anxiously refreshing his email, he enrolled in an online course to learn software that had become standard across the industry while he had been comfortably settled in his previous role. The tutorials were challenging. Several times he felt frustrated. "I should already know this," he muttered. Then he smiled. Perhaps this wasn't proof that he had fallen behind. Perhaps it was simply proof that he was still capable of learning. That evening, Emma returned home carrying groceries. "I have something to show you," Daniel said. He opened the notebook. She read the 3 questions quietly. "I like these." "I realized something today," Daniel replied. "I've been measuring my days only by whether someone offers me a job." "And?" "I've forgotten that a day can still be meaningful even if nothing dramatic happens." Emma smiled. "I think that's one of the hardest lessons adulthood teaches us." Days became weeks. Not every day felt hopeful. Some applications received polite rejections. Others received no response at all. Occasionally, Daniel questioned whether his efforts mattered. On those afternoons, he returned to the notebook. Sometimes the answers were surprisingly simple. "Today I learned something new. Today I helped my neighbor repair a fence. Today I cooked dinner for Emma. Today I finished another lesson." Individually, none of those moments seemed life-changing. Together, they quietly reminded him that his life had not stopped moving. One Saturday morning, while volunteering at a local community center, Daniel met Sophia, who owned the neighborhood bookstore a few streets away. She was organizing donated books for a literacy program. "I've seen you here the last few weekends," she said as they stacked boxes together. Daniel nodded. "I needed something useful to do. Sophia smiled. I know that feeling. She hesitated before continuing. My bookstore has been struggling. Daniel looked surprised. I thought it was always busy. It used to be. She glanced around the room. But life has a habit of changing without asking our permission. Daniel laughed softly. It certainly does. For the next hour, they sorted children's books, novels, and well-worn encyclopedias into neat piles. Neither of them spoke much about their personal worries. They didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Both were standing in unfamiliar seasons. Before leaving, Sophia handed Daniel a thin hardcover book. There aren't many words, she said. It's mostly photographs. Daniel looked at the cover. It showed a forest recovering after a wildfire. Inside were photographs taken over several years. The first pages showed blackened trees and scorched earth. The images felt almost hopeless. But as he turned the pages, tiny green shoots began appearing. Then wildflowers. Then birds returning. By the final pages, the forest was alive again. The photographer had written only one sentence beneath the last image. Nature never mistakes recovery for failure, simply because it takes time. Daniel closed the book slowly. I think I needed this. Sophia smiled. I did too. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. We often expect growth to feel exciting. In reality, growth is frequently quiet, repetitive, and almost invisible while it is happening. Learning one new skill. Making one thoughtful decision. Showing up one more time. Choosing patience over frustration. These actions rarely feel extraordinary. Yet they are the very habits from which extraordinary resilience is built. Consider a stone bridge that has stood for centuries. It was not completed in a single day. One carefully placed stone supported the next. The builders may never have imagined how many generations would one day walk across it. Likewise, every small act of courage we practice today becomes part of the bridge carrying us toward tomorrow. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. Maybe you've underestimated the value of small progress because it didn't look dramatic. You exercised for 20 minutes. You made one difficult phone call. You apologized. You forgave. You completed one page instead of an entire chapter. At first glance, those moments appear insignificant. Yet life is rarely changed by one giant decision alone. It is shaped by hundreds of quiet choices repeated faithfully over time. Hope grows in much the same way. It is strengthened every time we choose movement instead of paralysis, curiosity instead of fear, patience instead of despair. The future is rarely rebuilt through one spectacular breakthrough. More often, it is rebuilt through ordinary mornings when we quietly decide to keep going. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, Daniel realized something unexpected. Although he still hoped for a new job, it was no longer the only thing giving his days meaning. He was becoming more patient, more present, more appreciative of conversations he once rushed through. The uncertainty had not disappeared, but it had begun teaching him lessons that certainty never could. And while Daniel was slowly rebuilding his confidence, Sophia was facing a challenge of her own. Each evening, as she locked the door of her beloved bookstore, she wondered how many more times she would be able to turn the key before the story she had spent 15 years writing came to an end. Sophia stood in the doorway of her bookstore long after the last customer had left. The street outside was growing quiet. The bakery next door had already turned off its lights. A few shop owners were pulling down shutters and heading home to their families. Inside the bookstore, however, Sophia remained still. She looked across the shelves she'd spent years carefully building. Every section carried memories, books recommended to nervous young readers, conversations with customers who had become friends, children who once needed help finding their first chapter book and now returned as adults looking for stories of their own. The bookstore had never simply been a business. It had become part of her life. That was why the declining sales frightened her so much. If the store disappeared, she wasn't sure what part of herself would disappear with it. Over the following weeks, she studied the accounts every evening. The numbers refused to improve. Fewer people were visiting. Online retailers offered lower prices. Several neighboring shops had already closed. Sometimes she wondered whether she was simply delaying the inevitable. One particularly difficult afternoon, a heavy rainstorm kept nearly everyone indoors. Hours passed without a single customer. Sophia sat behind the counter staring at the empty entrance. By late afternoon, discouragement had settled over her like a heavy blanket. Then the bell above the door chimed. A young girl stepped inside holding an umbrella almost as large as she was. Water dripped from the edge of her raincoat. She couldn't have been older than 10. "Can I help you?" Sophia asked. The girl nodded. "I'm looking for a book." "What kind?" The girl thought carefully. "A book about someone who doesn't give up." Sophia smiled. "That's a wonderful category." Together they wandered through the aisles. Eventually they found a story about a young explorer who faced setbacks, storms, and failures before finally reaching his destination. The girl hugged the book against her chest. "My teacher says stories help us borrow courage." Sophia blinked. "What did she say?" "She said sometimes people in books remind us we can be brave too." After the girl left, Sophia stood quietly among the shelves. "Stories help us borrow courage." The words echoed in her mind. For years, she had focused on selling books. Perhaps she had forgotten what books actually gave people. Not information, not entertainment alone. Perspective, comfort, possibility, courage. That evening, instead of reviewing her financial statements, Sophia took a notebook and wrote a different question across the top of the page. "Why did I open this bookstore?" The answers came quickly. To create a place where people felt welcome, to help children discover imagination, to connect strangers through stories, to remind people they were not alone. By the time she finished writing, she noticed something surprising. The reasons that had inspired her in the beginning still existed. The circumstances had changed. The purpose had not. The next morning, she decided to experiment. Using her phone, she recorded a short video recommending 3 books that had helped her through difficult seasons. The video wasn't polished. She stumbled over a few words. The lighting was imperfect. She almost deleted it before posting. Instead, she pressed publish and went back to work. Only a handful of people watched it. But one viewer shared it, then another. A local teacher recommended it to parents. A community group invited her to speak about books that encourage resilience. The growth was slow, painfully slow. Yet it was movement. And movement felt very different from waiting. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. Difficult seasons often tempt us to focus entirely on what is ending. The job we lost, the opportunity that disappeared, the relationship that changed, the plan that no longer works. When this happens, we can become so focused on preserving the past that we overlook new possibilities quietly emerging in the present. This does not mean we should ignore grief. Endings deserve to be acknowledged. They deserve respect. But every ending also creates space. And within that space, something new often begins to take shape. History offers countless examples. Entire industries have been transformed because someone adapted when circumstances changed. Writers discovered new audiences. Artists explored new styles. Entrepreneurs created solutions that never would have existed had everything remained comfortable. Change is rarely welcomed at first, yet it often becomes the doorway through which growth enters. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. Maybe a door closed that you desperately wanted to keep open. At the time, it felt unfair, disappointing, even devastating. Yet months or years later, you discovered that another path had been quietly waiting. Not necessarily a better path, but one that taught you something valuable. One that helped you become someone you might never have become otherwise. The challenge, of course, is that we rarely recognize this while we are living through it. We want certainty before taking action. We want guarantees before making changes. Life rarely offers either. Instead, it invites us to move forward with incomplete information and trust that clarity will arrive gradually. Sophia began experiencing this firsthand. Every week she posted another book recommendation. Some attracted attention, others barely reached anyone. Yet she continued, not because she knew exactly where the effort would lead, because she remembered why she started. Purpose became more reliable than certainty. Months later, a local school invited her to host reading sessions for students. Soon afterward, a community organization asked her to create reading lists for families. The bookstore itself was still facing challenges, but new opportunities were beginning to grow around it. Opportunities she never would have discovered if she had spent all her energy mourning what used to be. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by the store after finishing another online training course. He noticed a small crowd gathered near the children's section. Parents were listening while Sophia read aloud from a picture book. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, completely absorbed. After the session ended, Daniel smiled. "Looks busy," Sophia laughed. "Busier than it was." "You seem happier." She considered the observation carefully. "I think I've stopped trying to save the bookstore exactly as it used to be. And I'm trying to help it become what it needs to become now." Daniel nodded. He understood. In many ways, he was learning the same lesson. Neither of them could return to the life they had before. But perhaps that wasn't the goal anymore. Perhaps the goal was to grow into the life that was waiting ahead. As winter deepened, both Daniel and Sophia continued moving forward one day at a time. Neither could see the entire road. Neither knew exactly how their stories would unfold. Yet something had changed. The future no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a mystery. And there is an important difference between the two. Fear views uncertainty as a threat. Hope learns to view uncertainty as possibility. That shift rarely happens overnight. It grows gradually, through experience, through small victories, through lessons learned in ordinary days, and often through the people who choose to walk beside us when the path becomes difficult. Because one of the most powerful sources of hope is not found within us alone. It is found in the relationships that remind us we were never meant to carry every burden by ourselves. Daniel had always believed that asking for help was something other people did. Not because he lacked compassion. If a neighbor needed assistance moving furniture, Daniel was there. If a colleague was overwhelmed by a project, he stayed late without complaint. If a friend called with bad news, he listened patiently for as long as they needed. Helping others had always come naturally. Being helped felt entirely different. As the weeks passed, Emma began noticing small changes. Daniel still completed his online courses. He still applied for jobs each morning. He still smiled when she asked how his day had been. But there were moments when his shoulders seemed heavier than before. Moments when he stared quietly through the living room window without realizing how much time had passed. One evening, Emma placed 2 mugs of tea on the table. "I've been thinking," she said. Daniel smiled. "That usually means you've already decided something." She laughed. "Probably." She slid a small flyer across the table. It advertised a monthly gathering at the local community center called New Beginnings. The description was simple: a place where people facing career changes, personal loss, or major life transitions can share experiences, practical advice, and encouragement. Daniel looked at it for only a moment before sliding it back. "I don't think that's for me." "Why not?" "I don't really want to sit in a room talking about my problems." Emma nodded. "I understand." She didn't argue. Instead, she quietly changed the subject. 3 days later, Daniel received another rejection email. He closed the laptop more gently than usual, not because it hurt less, because he was becoming tired of letting disappointment control every afternoon. He walked into the kitchen. The flyer was still resting on the counter. That evening, he drove to the community center. He almost turned around twice before reaching the parking lot. Inside, a volunteer greeted him with a warm smile. "First time?" Daniel nodded. You can sit anywhere. The room was surprisingly ordinary. There was no stage, no speeches, no formal introductions. People simply sat in a circle holding cups of coffee. Some looked confident. Others looked nervous. Most looked like ordinary people who had quietly found themselves living lives they hadn't planned. The facilitator welcomed everyone. You don't have to speak tonight if you don't want to, she said. Sometimes listening is enough. Daniel appreciated that. For nearly an hour, he listened. A young woman described starting over after a divorce. An older gentleman spoke about retiring earlier than expected because of illness. A university student admitted feeling overwhelmed after changing career paths. No one interrupted. No one rushed to offer solutions. People simply listened with genuine attention. Toward the end of the evening, the facilitator looked gently toward Daniel. No pressure, she smiled. But would you like to tell us your name? He hesitated. I'm Daniel. The words came more easily than he expected. I lost my job about 2 months ago. He stopped there. The room remained completely silent. Not an uncomfortable silence, a welcoming one. Finally, the retired gentleman smiled. I know that feeling. Another woman nodded. So do I. The young student added quietly, You're in good company. 3 simple sentences. Yet something inside Daniel relaxed. For weeks, he had quietly believed he was carrying a burden unique to him. Now he realized that uncertainty had many companions. As people began leaving, the retired gentleman introduced himself. My name's Peter. They walked toward the parking lot together. I used to think strength meant solving every problem myself, Peter said. So did I. Peter laughed softly. It took me 70 years to learn that even bridges need more than one support. Daniel smiled. I've never thought about it like that. None of us were designed to carry everything alone. That sentence stayed with Daniel during the drive home. When he walked through the front door, Emma immediately noticed something different. How was it? He placed his keys on the table. I didn't realize how tired I'd become. She looked puzzled. Talking about it made you tired? He shook his head. Pretending I was fine made me tired. Emma reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Sometimes the greatest comfort is simply knowing someone understands. The following Saturday, Sophia was arranging books in the front display when she noticed an elderly customer standing in the history section. His name was Mr. Harris. He had visited the bookstore almost every week for years. Normally, he spent hours browsing. Today, he seemed distracted. After several minutes, Sophia walked over. Looking for something special? He smiled politely. Not really. There was a hesitation in his voice. My wife always chose the books. Sophia remembered. The couple had visited together for nearly 15 years. Mrs. Harris had passed away earlier that spring. Mr. Harris looked around uncertainly. I don't really know what to read anymore. Sophia didn't recommend a bestseller. She didn't search for the newest release. Instead, she quietly walked toward a nearby shelf and selected a slim collection of travel essays. My husband loved books like these, Mr. Harris said. Sophia smiled. I know. He looked surprised. You remembered? I remember both of you. Mr. Harris stood quietly holding the book. After a long pause, he spoke. You know what's strange? What? I thought I came here to buy books. He looked around the familiar shop. I think I actually came because it still feels like a place where she and I spent happy afternoons. Sophia felt her eyes grow warm. You'll always be welcome here. He smiled gently. I know. After he left, Sophia remained standing between the shelves. She realized her bookstore had become something she had never planned, not merely a place where books were sold, a place where memories were kept alive, a place where people quietly found pieces of themselves again. That evening, she wrote another sentence in the notebook where she had once asked why she opened the bookstore. She added, Sometimes people don't come looking for books. Sometimes they come looking for hope. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. We often underestimate the healing power of simply being present for another person. We imagine we must have perfect advice, the right words, a solution. Yet some of the most meaningful moments in life happen when someone simply reminds us that we don't have to carry our story alone. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself. A conversation that didn't solve your problem, but somehow made it easier to face. A friend who listened without trying to fix everything. Someone who remembered your name, your story, or a detail that made you feel seen. These moments may seem small, but they quietly restore something essential. They remind us that we matter. And when people begin believing they matter again, hope has already started doing its work. Daniel discovered this at the community center. Sophia discovered it among the bookshelves. Neither received immediate solutions. What they received was something just as valuable. The reassurance that even during life's most uncertain seasons, no one has to walk the road entirely alone. For hope has always grown best when shared from one heart to another. The weeks slowly settled into a new rhythm. Every Tuesday evening, Daniel attended the New Beginnings gathering. Every Thursday afternoon, Sophia hosted a small reading circle at the bookstore. Neither of them would have imagined, only a few months earlier, that these simple routines would become some of the most important parts of their week. Not because they solved every problem, but because they reminded them that progress is rarely measured only by outcomes. Sometimes it is measured by the people we become along the way. One Tuesday evening, Peter arrived carrying an old leather notebook. After everyone had settled into their seats, he placed it gently on the table. "This notebook is older than some of you," he said with a smile. "I've been writing in it for almost 30 years. The group looked at him curiously. "Is it a journal?" someone asked. "In a way." Peter opened to a page filled with neat handwriting. "Whenever something difficult happened in my life, I wrote down what I believed in that moment." He flipped to another page. "When I lost my business, I wrote, 'I'll never recover from this.'" A few people nodded quietly. He turned another page. "After my wife became ill, I wrote, 'Nothing will ever feel normal again.'" Then he smiled. A few years later, I read those entries again. "And?" Daniel asked. "I realized every one of those sentences had felt completely true." He paused before continuing. "But none of them were permanent." The room became very still. Peter gently closed the notebook. "Our feelings deserve respect. They don't always deserve the final word." Daniel found himself thinking about that sentence long after the meeting ended. How many times had he quietly mistaken a temporary emotion for a permanent truth? When he felt discouraged, he assumed he would always feel discouraged. When he felt uncertain, he imagined certainty had disappeared forever. Yet looking back over his own life, he realized that wasn't how life had ever worked. There had been other difficult seasons. His father's illness, the early years of paying off a mortgage, the months after Emma lost her mother. At the time, each challenge had seemed overwhelming, yet each had eventually become another chapter in a much larger story. Perhaps this season would too. The next morning, Daniel opened his notebook and added a fourth question beneath the other three. Will this still matter 5 years from now? He didn't ask the question to dismiss today's worries. He asked it to restore perspective. Some problems required immediate attention. Others only felt enormous because they were standing too close. That simple habit gradually changed the way he responded to disappointment. When another rejection email arrived, he allowed himself a few minutes to feel discouraged. Then he asked the question, will this one email define my life 5 years from now? The answer was obvious. No. He closed the laptop and sent another application. It wasn't optimism. It was perspective. Across town, Sophia was discovering something equally unexpected. The reading circles had become increasingly popular. Parents lingered after the sessions. Children eagerly recommended books to one another. Some adults admitted they had started reading again for the first time in years. One Saturday afternoon, while rearranging a display near the front window, Sophia noticed a familiar face standing hesitantly outside. It was Lily, the young girl who had once asked for a book about someone who didn't give up. She stepped inside carrying a worn paperback. "I finished it," she announced proudly. Sophia smiled. "What did you think?" Lily held the book carefully. "The explorer wasn't brave all the time." "No, he was scared a lot." Sophia laughed. "That's usually how courage works." Lily looked thoughtful. "I used to think brave people weren't afraid." "So did I." The little girl considered that for a moment. "My teacher says courage means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Sophia nodded. "Your teacher sounds very wise." Lily smiled. "I think books helped her learn that." After choosing another novel, she skipped happily toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back. "Thank you." Sophia watched her disappear down the street. She realized something remarkable. Months earlier, she had believed she was fighting to save a bookstore. Now she understood she had been protecting something much larger, a place where courage quietly passed from one person to another, a place where stories reminded people that they were never the first to face uncertainty, and therefore they would not be the last to overcome it. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. Hope has always been deeply connected to perspective. When we are standing in the middle of difficulty, our vision naturally narrows. We focus on today's disappointment, today's uncertainty, today's unanswered questions. Yet hope gently widens our view. It reminds us that today's chapter is part of a much longer story. Imagine reading only the middle pages of a novel. You would find conflict, confusion, characters making mistakes, dreams appearing to fall apart. If you stopped reading there, you might assume the story ended in disappointment. Only by continuing do you discover how those difficult chapters shaped everything that followed. Life often feels the same while we are living it. We experience it one page at a time. We rarely know how today's events will make sense years from now. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. Maybe there was a setback that eventually redirected you toward an opportunity you could never have planned. A disappointment that introduced you to someone who changed your life. A season of waiting that quietly prepared you for responsibilities you weren't yet ready to carry. At the time, none of it made sense. Only in hindsight did the pattern begin to emerge. This doesn't mean every hardship has an obvious reason. Some questions remain unanswered. Some losses will always hurt. But even then, we can choose not to let one painful chapter become the title of our entire story. History quietly reflects this truth. Many of the world's greatest achievements were built upon early failures that, at the time, looked final. Inventors endured repeated setbacks. Explorers turned back before eventually finding new routes. Scientists spent years pursuing ideas that seemed to lead nowhere. Had they believed every disappointment was the conclusion, their stories would have ended far too soon. Our own lives deserve the same patience. Daniel was beginning to understand this. So was Sophia. Neither knew exactly what the future held. Yet both had stopped demanding immediate certainty. Instead, they had begun trusting something quieter. That faithful effort, meaningful relationships, and patient hope often reveal tomorrow, one day at a time. As winter slowly began giving way to the first hints of spring, both of them noticed something they hadn't expected. Their circumstances were changing, but even more importantly, they were changing. The first signs of spring arrived so quietly that most people barely noticed them. A few blossoms appeared on trees that had stood bare for months. The mornings grew a little brighter. Birdsong returned before sunrise. Nothing happened all at once, yet the season was unmistakably changing. Daniel found himself thinking about that one Saturday morning as he walked through the park where he had first met the elderly man by the lake. He had returned many times since then, not because he expected another life-changing conversation, but because the place reminded him how far he had already come. He sat on the same wooden bench and looked across the calm water. Months earlier, he had arrived carrying fear. Today, he still carried uncertainty. But uncertainty no longer felt quite so heavy. As he watched the gentle ripples spread across the lake, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Good morning. May I speak with Daniel?" "This is Daniel. I'm calling regarding the position you applied for a few weeks ago." He listened carefully. The company wanted to invite him for a final interview. Daniel thanked the caller and ended the conversation. For a few moments, he simply sat in silence. He smiled, not because he believed the job was already his, but because he realized something surprising. Only a few months earlier, that phone call would have determined his entire emotional state. Now, it felt different. Of course, he hoped things would go well. But he also knew that one interview no longer defined his worth. Whatever happened, he would continue moving forward. That realization filled him with a quiet confidence he had never experienced before. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by the bookstore. Sophia was arranging a display of gardening books near the entrance. "You look different," she said. "I had some good news." He told her about the interview. "That's wonderful." "I hope so," she smiled knowingly. "I noticed you said 'I hope so.' Not everything depends on this." Daniel laughed. "I guess I've changed." "I think you have." He looked around the bookstore. "So have you." The shop felt alive. Children sat reading in one corner. Two older gentlemen were discussing travel books near the window. A young mother was asking for recommendations for her son. The bookstore still wasn't overflowing with customers, but it no longer felt fragile. It felt rooted. Sophia noticed Daniel watching the room. "You know what I've learned?" "What?" "I kept trying to bring back the bookstore I used to have." She paused. "Hey! I never imagined I could build one that meant even more." Daniel nodded slowly. Maybe that's true for people too. Neither of them spoke for a while. Some conversations don't need many words. A week later, the community center held its annual neighborhood gathering. Families brought homemade food. Children played games in the courtyard. Musicians from the local college volunteered to perform throughout the afternoon. The atmosphere felt wonderfully ordinary. Daniel arrived with Emma. Sophia came carrying several boxes of donated books for a children's reading corner. Peter greeted everyone with his familiar, warm smile. As the afternoon unfolded, Daniel looked around the courtyard. There, in one place, were people from many different stages of life. Some were celebrating, some were quietly healing, some were beginning new chapters, others were helping people through theirs. It occurred to him that no one in the courtyard had lived a perfect life. Every person carried invisible stories, dreams fulfilled, dreams postponed, joy, heartache, success, failure, hope. Yet together they created something beautiful, community. Peter wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You look thoughtful." "I was just realizing something." Peter smiled. "Go on." "I spent months believing I'd lost my place in the world. And?" Daniel looked around again. "I think I was looking in the wrong direction." Peter nodded. "Sometimes purpose isn't found by looking inward. Where is it found?" "In showing up." Daniel considered those words. Showing up. For his family. For new opportunities. For strangers. For himself. It sounded almost too simple. Yet many of life's greatest transformations begin with exactly that, the willingness to keep showing up. There is a quiet lesson hidden here. Hope is not sustained only by extraordinary moments. It is strengthened through ordinary faithfulness. Returning after disappointment. Trying again after failure. Listening when someone needs to be heard. Offering kindness even when life feels difficult. These quiet decisions rarely attract attention, yet they shape the direction of our lives more than dramatic moments ever could. Perhaps you have experienced this yourself. When you look back over your life, The turning points may not have been grand achievements. Perhaps they were conversations, habits, friendships, simple decisions repeated over time. A decision to forgive, a decision to begin again, a decision to believe that tomorrow deserved another chance. The future is often changed in these quiet moments, not because they seem important at the time, but because they gradually change the person making them. A few days later, Daniel attended his interview. As he sat in the reception area, he noticed another candidate nervously reviewing notes. Months earlier, Daniel would have remained silent, focused entirely on his own anxiety. Instead, he smiled. "First interview with this company?" The man nodded. "I'm terrified." Daniel laughed softly. "So was I." They spoke for several minutes. Nothing profound, just ordinary conversation. Yet when the interviewer called the other candidate's name, the man smiled. "Thanks. I needed that." Daniel watched him walk away. Without realizing it, he had become the kind of person who quietly encouraged others, the very quality he had once needed so desperately himself. A few days later, Daniel received another phone call. This one lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, he looked toward Emma, who had been waiting quietly across the room. He smiled. "I got the job." Emma embraced him tightly. They laughed, they cried, they celebrated with a simple dinner that evening. Yet as Daniel reflected on the months that had led to this moment, he knew something important. The greatest gift of that difficult season had not been the new job. It had been the new perspective, the patience, the friendships, the resilience, the understanding that his identity had always been much larger than his profession. The job was a blessing. The person he had become along the journey was the greater reward. At almost the same time, Sophia locked the bookstore one evening after another successful reading session. She paused before turning off the lights. The shelves looked much the same as they always had. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Not because the building had changed, because she had. She no longer measured success only by sales. She measured it by the children discovering a love of reading, by conversations that lingered long after books had been purchased, by the quiet sense that people left her little bookstore carrying more hope than when they entered. She smiled to herself. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones no balance sheet can ever measure. As she stepped outside into the cool evening air, she noticed tiny blossoms opening along the trees lining the street. Spring had arrived. Quietly, patiently, exactly as it always had. And just like the changing seasons, hope had been growing all along, even on the days when neither Daniel nor Sophia could yet see it. The journey was not over. Life would still bring unexpected challenges. There would be more difficult seasons, more unanswered questions, more moments requiring courage. But now they carried something they hadn't possessed before. They knew that hope was no longer something they were waiting to find. It had become the way they had learned to live. Their stories, like ours, were never meant to be free from storms. They were meant to prove that even after the longest winter, the heart can still learn to welcome another spring. There is something quietly comforting about reaching the end of a journey and realizing that the destination is not a place at all. It is a different way of seeing. When we first began this journey together, we stood at the edge of uncertainty. The road ahead seemed hidden. The questions felt larger than the answers. Hope appeared fragile, almost as though it could disappear with the next difficult piece of news. Now, after walking beside Daniel, Sophia, Emma, Peter, and the many ordinary people whose lives gently crossed theirs, we can see something that was difficult to recognize at the beginning. Hope was never absent. It was simply growing in places that were too quiet to notice. It was growing in Daniel every time he chose to apply for one more opportunity instead of surrendering to disappointment. It was growing in Sophia each time she unlocked the bookstore doors, even when she wasn't certain enough customers would walk through them. It was growing in Emma through her steady encouragement, reminding us that love is often expressed not through grand speeches, but through quiet presence. It was growing in Peter, whose own difficult chapters became a source of wisdom for people he had never expected to meet. And perhaps, without even realizing it, it has been growing within you as well. One of the greatest gifts difficult seasons offer is perspective. Not while we are living through them. Perspective rarely arrives that quickly. It often comes later when we pause long enough to look back. Only then do we notice the conversations that changed us, the strangers who became friends, the disappointments that quietly redirected us, the strengths we never knew we possessed until circumstances asked us to use them. Life has a remarkable way of revealing its meaning in reverse. The pieces rarely make sense while we are arranging them. Only later do we see how beautifully they fit together. Perhaps there is a chapter in your own life that still feels unfinished, a question that remains unanswered, a dream that seems delayed, a burden that feels heavier than you expected. If so, remember this. An unfinished chapter is not an unfinished life. A delayed answer is not a forgotten prayer. A closed door is not the end of every path. Some of life's most meaningful beginnings arrive quietly, disguised as unexpected endings. Think again of the changing seasons. Winter never asks the trees to prove that spring is coming. The roots continue their unseen work beneath frozen ground. The earth patiently prepares for life long before the first blossom appears. Nature is never anxious about becoming. It simply continues. Perhaps there is wisdom in that. Perhaps we too can learn to trust the quiet work taking place beneath the surface of our own lives. Not every lesson announces itself immediately. Not every answer arrives when we expect it. Some truths require time. Some strengths require waiting. Some forms of hope grow only after we have walked farther than we thought we could. If this journey has offered one message above all others, it is that your circumstances do not have the final word. They may shape your path. They may change your plans. They may ask more of you than you ever imagined giving. But they cannot decide who you become. That choice remains gently, faithfully, and courageously yours. Every morning you rise after a difficult night. Every conversation where kindness overcomes frustration. Every moment you choose patience instead of despair. Every small step taken without certainty. These are the quiet decisions that shape a remarkable life, not because they are dramatic, because they are faithful. The world often celebrates extraordinary achievements, yet it is built upon ordinary people who quietly refuse to give up. Parents who continue loving through exhaustion. Teachers who believe in students before those students believe in themselves. Friends who answer the phone when someone needs to talk. Neighbors who notice when another person's burden has become too heavy. People who choose compassion when judgment would be easier. This is how hope travels. Not in great leaps, but from one heart to another. From one conversation to the next. From one ordinary act of kindness to another. You may never fully know how your own story will encourage someone else. A word you speak today may remain with another person for years. A kindness you barely remember may become the reason someone chooses to keep going. Just as Peter's wisdom shaped Daniel. Just as Sophia's bookstore became a refuge for countless visitors. Just as Emma's quiet encouragement gave strength when words were difficult to find. Your life has the ability to become part of someone else's healing. Never underestimate that gift. And when another difficult season eventually arrives, as seasons always do, I hope you remember these stories. I hope you remember Daniel sitting quietly beside the lake, discovering that losing a job did not mean losing himself. I hope you remember Sophia realizing that purpose can remain steady even when circumstances change. I hope you remember Peter's worn notebook, reminding us that our emotions deserve to be felt, but they do not always predict our future. I hope you remember that progress is often invisible while it is happening, that courage frequently walks hand in hand with fear, that asking for help is not weakness, that beauty still exists even in seasons touched by sorrow. Most of all, I hope you remember that hope is not something reserved for people whose lives are easy. It belongs to anyone willing to believe that today's struggle is not tomorrow's destiny. As we bring this journey to a close, imagine standing once more beside that quiet lake where Daniel first began to see life differently. The water is calm. The trees sway gently in the evening breeze. The path stretches ahead, disappearing around a bend you cannot yet see. You do not know exactly what lies beyond it. No one ever does, but you have learned something important. You do not need to see the entire path before taking the next step. You have walked far enough to trust that the road will continue revealing itself, one faithful day at a time. And perhaps that is what hope has always been, not certainty about tomorrow, but quiet confidence in the strength you are building today. So wherever this narration finds you, whether you are celebrating a new beginning, carrying a burden that no one else can see, waiting patiently for better days, or simply searching for a little peace in a busy world, may you remember that your story is still being written. May you treat yourself with the same kindness you so willingly offer others. May you notice the quiet beauty that still surrounds you, even on difficult days. May you never hesitate to lean on those who care about you, and may you always be willing to become that source of strength for someone else. Above all, may you continue believing that even the longest winter cannot prevent the arrival of spring. Because hope has never depended on perfect circumstances. It grows through ordinary hearts that continue choosing courage, compassion, gratitude, and perseverance, one day at a time. Thank you for allowing me to share this journey with you. Here at the Hopeful Narrator, we believe that every story holds a quiet lesson, every season carries hidden wisdom, and every ending has the potential to become the beginning of something beautiful. Until our paths cross again, may you walk gently, live courageously, and always remember. No matter how difficult the season may seem, hope is already growing beneath the surface.